Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we're back with more Autobiography of a Freedom Writer. We're starting chapter 5, Becoming a Freedom Writer. So let's jump into this. On May the 4th, 1961, an interracial group of 13 activists organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, boarded buses at the terminals in Washington, D.C. and rode south together. They split into two groups. Some rode on the Greyhound bus and others on trailways. The destination was New Orleans, requiring travel through 6 states: Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Intent on ending racial segregation in interstate travel, the group was embarking on a freedom ride, a tactic of nonviolence direct action. The strategy pioneered by members of CORE. National Director James Farmer had been among members of the civil rights organizations who had organized a similar demonstration in 1947 called the Journey of Reconciliation, the model for the 1961 Freedom Ride. CORE's Washington staff recruited and trained the new group group writers, seeking to raise the pressure on the federal government to end segregation in the South. There should have been no question about racial segregation in interstate bus travel. The Supreme Court had twice declared it to be an unconstitutional violation of human rights. Also, the Interstate Commerce Commission had banned race restriction on buses and trains, lunch counters in terminals and airports, and in restrooms. Nevertheless, in 1961, interstate travel was still segregated. Conflict between certain states and the federal government over enforcing civil rights protection blocked any possibility of change. The Freedom Riders knew that Southern segregationists could be counted on to violate their civil rights, and that their simple acts of defiance might very well cost them their lives. However, they were undeterred in the efforts to force the apathetic nation to see the inequality they exposed and test the will of the administration of President John F. Kennedy to resolve it. Many of these men and women were beaten, bombed, harassed, and imprisoned. But, as historian Ray Armstong declared in his book Freedom Writers, 2007, collectively they turned a pivotal corner in the civil rights movement and demonstrated the power of individual action to transform the nation. On the whole, what started out as a single freedom ride in the spring of 1961 had 6 months later evolved into a full-scale movement with more than 400 Americans, young and old, male and female, black, white, religious, and secular, from the north, south, east, and west, riding integrated freedom buses into the deep south. In the security conscious Cold War suspicion of that era. Most Americans thought of the Freedom Riders as promoting social disorder, given to reckless abandon, and would be martyrs. A National Gallup poll conducted in late in May of 1961, after the ride started, found that 60% of Americans agreed with the Supreme Court's ruling that racial segregation on buses and trains was unconstitutional. However, only 24% agreed with the tactic of the Freedom Riders. Most of the Freedom Riders were ordinary people, many of them college students, as well as clergymen of various faiths with labor leaders. CORE recruited them from a network of civil rights organizations with wide-ranging concerns, from war and poverty to voting rights and racial and social intolerance. Each was required to sign an application consenting to participate, and they received some prior training. They were encouraged to think of themselves as role models. Farmer imposed a strict dress code: coats and ties for men, dresses and high heels for women. Their courage and unbending optimism produced a series of actions that shocked the nation into seeing up close the unresolved human crisis that propped up segregation. On May the 14th, Mother's Day, 1961, 2 weeks after the Freedom Ride embarked on its journey, the Greyhound bus carrying riders and regular passengers pulled out into a deserted terminal in Anniston, Alabama. The bus was surrounded by a screaming mob of about 50 men and boys, some of whom were later identified as KKK, carrying metal pipes and chains. The passengers had been able to seal the door for a time. Unable to get inside, the mob began a series of attacks on the exterior of the bus, breaking windows and slashing tires. The crippled bus returned to the highway, where the swarm of vigilantes returned and firebombed the bus. The passengers barely escaped being burned alive. Some were beaten as they came off the bus. As they sat on the ground, coughing and bleeding, the crowd of white residents from the surrounding community mostly stood by and watched, except for a few, including a 12-year-old girl who carried buckets of water to aid the injured. The girl's family was later run out of town for her choice of action, as I understand it. That same day, 1 hour after the Greyhound bus first pulled into Anniston, the Trailways coach carrying Freedom Riders also reached Anniston, where a mob boarded the bus and beat the riders with fists and clubs. The bus managed to escape Anniston and reach Birmingham, where the Commissioner of Public Safety, Bull Connor, encouraged another mob to savagely attack the riders a second time, leaving them bloody and battered. That evening, in the lobby of a dormitory on Tougaloo's campus, I sat with other students, riveted to the television news broadcast of a savage scene. The flames that consumed the Greyhound bus and clouds of black smoke rose into the sky. The beaten and bandaged Freedom Riders wore black and white, who would not be stopped. It had an enormous impact on my life. The Kennedy administration's lack of concrete support for the writers to this point helped to solidify my adherence to the movement. I felt that I had to do something to help gain the critical presidential support. Civil rights protection went to the very core of Tougaloo's historic tradition. The courage of the Freedom Riders touched the hearts and minds of everyone there. Students followed the first ride with great intensity. As the demonstration continued, we would gather around various television sets in the recreational and other common areas on the campus after classes and lunch each day. We were anxious to absorb whatever information came in about the happening to the brave men and women who had come from all over the country and were our same age. The Freedom Ride almost ended after the attack in Birmingham until a second group of riders, mostly from Nashville, sit-ins came to replace the first group. The FBI, meanwhile, provided no protection to the riders. The second wave of riders left Birmingham on May the 15th. At the terminal in Montgomery, they too were viciously attacked as they stepped off the bus. Several were chased into the streets and into other buildings as they sought cover. Somehow they managed to get back on the bus and continue their ride. The next stop would be in Jackson, Mississippi. For what had seemed like a month leading up to this point, as if expecting an invasion, officials in our state began what I call the big lie. They wanted the world to think that they intended to treat the arriving Freedom Riders with the greatest amount of professionalism and courtesy. The unspoken truth was they thought they would teach the riders a lesson. Mississippi is ready, declared John Wright, head of the White Citizens Council in Jackson. At the same time, other officials were said to be informing the U.S. Justice Department after that all the Freedom Riders would be killed if they came to Mississippi. As a student body at Tougaloo, we were not going to let that happen without a fight. The same night, Governor Ross Barnett appeared on TV telling everyone, "The Negroes in Mississippi are satisfied with the conditions here." That made me furious. I rejected the idea that the lives of black Mississippians would be confined to second-class citizenship. Witnessing the horrific attacks on the riders made me realize I had to get more deeply involved in the freedom struggle. I had to let the world know that most citizens of Mississippi were tired of being at the bottom of the economic and education ladders. Blacks were tired of inferior schools and housing conditions. We were tired of not being able to make enough money to feed our children. I wanted to send a message to Governor Barnett. You are wrong in your assessment of the black citizens of Mississippi. But we'll go ahead and stop there. So, yeah. Let me say first, I do apologize for the slanged word used. Again, I say the words for realization of history's sake. If I'm watching a video or something, I don't say them because I don't take pleasure in them. But I see everything as important to show. History is not pretty. You know, it's full of very ugly things. Yes, there are some great and wonderful things to look at, but there are some very ugly points in history that needs to be, uh, you know, yes, this happened. We have to be aware of it. And unfortunately, there are those today that would, try to censor, try to ban, because they don't want things realized. But yeah, you gotta remember what's going on is all over the country. You have, especially in the deep south. If you watched my videos on the speeches and writings of Dr. King, you know that even in the north there were conditions that weren't uh, friendly to African Americans. So even in the north there was issues, but it was by far most visible in the south. They didn't hide what they did or how they felt. You were going to know. And it's just, it's wrong what was done. Unfortunately, this country was founded at a time when the enslavement of others was considered, yeah, that's just the way things are. And unfortunately, it's something that stayed until the Civil War, but even after that, there was terrorizing and lynching and killing, harassing of African Americans that continued to happen all through up in over 100 years, because it continued into the 60s and into the 70s. Most people want to think, oh, well, we're better than that now. This stuff, it's nowhere near as visible, but it isn't gone. It's under the surface. And it comes to the surface when things are made tougher on Americans, because then it's like, well, my life's tough. I have to have somebody to blame, even though it's not necessarily what's in your mind. That's what happens sometimes. That's why uh, immigrants from Mexico and Central America, South America, are or people who just have that heritage in them. They're often being blamed now because it's like, why don't you stay in your own country? A lot of it is America and American companies are like, stick that nose into that country. I could make money off this. And it leaves a terrible legacy when everything's said and done. But, that's what we also have with African Americans. There's there's been a terrible legacy, terrible stain left by what has been done. Like I said, history's never a pretty thing. It's never just a beautiful thing. You can have patriotism, love of country, but you've got to realize there are some ugly wounds, bloody gouges in history. It's just the way things are. But, as always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.